Okay, we are in record mode. Over to you. We have with us our facilitators, Drs. Knaus and Rogers Art, who are helping us in our continuing series of not only Saturday sessions, but other work sessions with both the board and other administrators in Tukwila. So thank you both for being. I'm going to address this beefy panel now.
Thank you, Superintendent Herndon. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, and audio check is working out. Good morning. It's nice to see you all again. A lot has been happening in this world, so it's great that we're able to convene on a Saturday morning. Thank you for being with us and for adjusting.
I think we're gonna have to get the sound adjusted. We can hardly hear you. So
Okay.
maybe flip and turn something up when he comes back in.
Okay. I just turned my volume all the way up, but that may not have helped anything on your end. So,
We also have the panel beeping in the background here, so.
okay. Why don't we wait a second until Dr. Herndon comes back in to see if he can adjust that.
Yeah, that's it.
Presuming that he's coming back in this morning.
He is. He is.
And we can check. Dr. Rogers Art, how's your audio? Because it's possible that it's my audio.
Hey, let's check that. How's everybody? I just pulled my mic close, so that might make a difference as well.
You are louder than Dr. Knaus.
Dr. Knaus is giving you early Saturday morning vibes. Leftover from the previous evening, I'm sure. So that's what's happening there.
I think
Over, Dr. Knaus.
no.
Teacher voice, Dr.
Teacher
Knaus.
voice, exactly. No, I also, let me just try it without my headset and the rest of the people. Is that better at all?
Yeah, it is better.
Yes.
Okay. So I can't hear you all as well, but I'll deal with that. This is just a technology issue. It's not like we're on Zoom regularly or anything. So let's move forward with my inside teacher voice. So good morning. Sounds like my voice is a little bit louder, so we can kickstart. We wanted to first off just appreciate you all as a collective board and then individually for the continual work that we have been walking alongside you this year. And to kickstart today, we wanted to touch base with what has kind of blown up a little bit around the world, but actually a little bit less so locally. Are you all familiar with, or did you even note that Seattle, the city council passed a ordinance to ban caste discrimination? So, right, locally, I think this has been mostly under the radar. CNN picked it up, and then it has kind of blown up in right-wing circles within a conversation of kind of anti-racism and racism. And wokeism and that sort of conversation. And so we wanted to start at some point because it's a local recognition and attempt at, in some ways, demonstrating like a solidarity with an expansion of definitions of what racism looks like globally. So on surface, sounds like kind of a thoughtful attempt. In practice, and given the outcomes, what we kind of argue with the critical race theory lens is we probably could have predicted these outcomes. Most people in the United States don't know what caste is. So we'll be talking a little bit more about caste and specifically within the United States context later this morning. But part of the conversation is that what happens when a city leads with an anti-racist lens, passes essentially an unfunded mandate to expand definitions across the city municipality to include a definition of some sort of discrimination, systemic discrimination, that the vast majority of people have no idea what it is, number one. And number two, there's a historical context of caste going back thousands of years within India, exacerbated by the British colonial system and infrastructure and imperialism throughout all of that. Most of that is not, well, I'll say all of that is not in the language of the ordinance. So part of what happens is essentially folks rally around, this has been happening around the globe. The UN has passed a similar ordinance. A number of municipalities within the West Coast have passed ordinances. So it's kind of like having a policy, racism is legal, without having any sort of infrastructures being connected to that conversation. So none of the actual infrastructures of the city of Seattle are changing. In fact, they're not even being considered as part of the change, right? So the ordinance is simply to change the language without changing, for example, the purpose, the mission, the function, and all of the infrastructures of the city of Seattle. So for example, then you think about what operates within the city of Seattle, public school system, which now has essentially a unfunded mandate through the city to deal with something that is, right, A, woefully inadequately prepared to do, B, hasn't actually committed to doing, C, isn't connected to the mission, purpose, and that sort of thing, right? So in the middle of doing something that isn't actually systemic or tied to breaking down kind of the infrastructures of racism to begin with, there's then this huge backlash globally that the city is also not prepared for. That the city was essentially like, why are all these people all around the globe now pissed at us? And social media blowing up. Again, most of this is not local. Most of this is not even with Seattle or with the Pacific Northwest. But folks essentially saying, this is the crux of the argument, is that the caste system, the folks who are on the lower ranks of the caste system are structurally, systemically oppressed, even when they're outside of India. We have maintained this same level of oppression across the globe with the same populations because, similar to race, caste is built in inherently within all of our systems, even if we're not in that country. Part of the problem is then we have folks who are largely in positions of privilege in the United States, Indian mostly folks who are at what we would say is the higher privileged ranks of the caste system, essentially pushing back and saying, look, you all, you are making it seem like we're oppressors. We're not oppressors, and we don't even live in India. So we can't be oppressing. So you're using this other system, and it parallels essentially white backlash around anti-racist movements. So those voices have been privileged and are sort of elevated within the conversation. So the actual folks who this is lifted for are even doubly marginalized by this conversation because they're not the voices of folks who are largely well employed within the United States anyway, right? So want to lift this as a super complicated, we'll break down a little bit more about how class operates within the United States using Isabel Wilkinson's book shortly. But essentially what happens when we don't actually address the larger systems of oppression and instead say, well, let's do an ordinance without actually doing a little bit more due diligence and connecting that ordinance to the structures of how we lead in the first place. And good morning. That's a lot.
And this is, we thought this would be really helpful because you're policymakers. And what we want to do is not what the city of Seattle has done here, where they, in an effort, I think, you know, maybe they felt like this was a great opportunity to show how they are moving towards anti-racism by saying, okay, we're going to ban caste discrimination. But the point is there is, as you said, unfunded and no structures and no instructions on how to continue with that in the city's main structures, i.e. education. So when we thought about you as a board, when we met last time, we were like, you know what, we do want to move towards anti-racism. And everyone on the board meeting said, yes, that's what we want to do. But what we want to avoid is replicating what's happened here, where we're like, yes, we're going to do this. And we're going to say a policy that says, yes, no, you know, we are anti-racist, and no structure, no funding, and no instructions on how to actually dismantle the very same structures that we're trying to push back upon. So we want to mirror that for you.
So can since we're on the word caste, you may or may not be aware that in the Washington State Constitution, Article 9, education, the preamble says, it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders without distinction or preference on account of race, color, caste, or sex.
Yep.
So when was that article enacted?
1889.
Yeah.
And how are we doing on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with how we're doing on that.
And
Yeah.
Are we already dealing with this, and that we passed a policy a few years ago, an anti-racist policy? And now we're trying to catch up with what the procedure is to get there. I mean, I think we're doing that as a district. And we're finally putting money to it and bigger work.
Yeah, I think we're not going to do small groups, we'll do whole group. We are a small group. I think that I appreciate what Seattle has done. I appreciate that there was 1887?
1889 was the day of statehood. I mean, the Constitution was developed, I think, probably the year before or something like that.
So 1889, 2023 for the city of Seattle. And still we have no idea. I was going to say we have no idea how. We do know how. We as a people, those of us who are in this country, have a really difficult time actually breaking down the systemic pieces around race that allow it to continue, right? So critical race theorists talk about the permanence of racism, but even beyond that, even when we have articles from 1889, 2023, we still have racism, and we still do not educate all students, fairly and equitably, because it's baked into our system. So I think what we wanted to start with was, as board members, as we move forward, we have to figure out how we're dismantling systems, the systems that are inherent, right, in our country, in our education system, the system that's inherent in our education system. It is 8 a.m. Wow, that was a poorly formed sentence. What I guess I'm trying to say is you can't just put a policy on it. We have to be able to really work through some of the systemic pieces, and those pieces are the ones that maintain and move to self-correct.
Isn't that one of our challenges in that as a board, we're policymakers? And we leave it, and we are overseers of the staff enacting the policies. So we basically hand that off. And I mean, yeah, I'll just say that.
Right. So you enact a policy, but I think when we know better, we do better. So we are going to enact a policy that it has funding attached to it, that has support attached to it, and that names the system. These are the pieces that we're going to talk about in CAST, that names the system, that says, here's what we're going to target first, right? So as an example, my district here in Oakland has an anti-racist policy that was beautifully written. It's gorgeous. It covers everything. No funding, and no instructions on where to begin, right? And so these are the pieces, and I'm saying what I would like for Tukwila board, given the fact that we've seen this happen, and not just Oakland, over, for several years.
1889.
Right, since 1889. I would like us to think about that a little more closely, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree.
And part of the way that we do that is to continually name where we are and upon whose land and how we are upon whose land, right? So roll with us as I read our land, labor, and body acknowledgement and recognition, please. And of course, read along. We acknowledge that we live and work on unceded ancestral land of numerous Coast Salish nations. We recognize ongoing displacement of Indigenous peoples and pay respect to all Indigenous peoples, past and present. We further acknowledge that the burden of environmental exploitation and systemic injustice falls upon the labor of Black and Brown bodies in the building of this country and its institutions. We remember that Black and Brown people were born and died working this land against their will for generations. We also acknowledge the continued contribution of the labor of survivors over the centuries to today of all immigrant labor, including involuntary, voluntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples in the building of what we refer to as the United States.
So just wanted to remind, what?
Go ahead.
At one point, I asked if we could include that with our opening statement. Because I think that second paragraph is essential. So I'll ask that again.
What do you need from us to make that happen?
Well, we would need your permission to use that statement, and we would need agreement with us to also include that. So I don't think we can do that right now. I'm just putting it out there that I would like us to do that.
Mhm.
We can do that right now if,
We can give permission right now, yes.
yeah, absolutely.
All right,
So
thank you.
what we'll do is we can make this available to Flip, who can make it available to y'all. And then whatever you need to do that.
Happily.
Is this slide 4, Chris?
3.
Slide 3. We'll make that available.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So just wanting to remind you, why we're here and the work that we're doing for the year. And we've met with our site leaders and our central office leaders. I had a little bout with COVID, so we had to shift the dates a little bit, but we will be, today is our board meeting, and then our next board meeting is May 13th. We'll be meeting March 29th with the site and district leaders, and then meeting May 2nd, 3rd, and 4th with the site and district leaders again. So robust amounts of time, and looking forward to pulling it all together in May. Chris and I believe that this is our theory of action, but also this is the way that we believe that we approach the work, right? That if you remember the first time we met, we start with definitions, and then we want to strengthen our skills, which is where I would say we are now, to disrupt these beliefs and behaviors. And then, sort of what we talked about at the very beginning, right, is to dismantle those things that are embedded, right? White supremacist beliefs, behaviors, and structures that are embedded specifically in our school districts. And then that gives us room then to dream and design what could be, right? And certainly this is not linear, right? Because sometimes we have to go back and was like, what does that mean? Let's go back and talk about that. But the capacity to dream is where we sort of leave. I noticed that a lot of anti-racist movements sort of don't go there. We want to dream that, and we want to be able to design what could be, right? And so that speaks to the notion that we spoke about with these policies, making sure we have what we need so we can dream and design. That's our theory of action. Today, we're going to continue to build our brave, accountable space. Just wanted to review our prior engagement and learning, which we just did. We're going to talk about CAST today, and then we're going to go back and look at the Jamboard that you did when last we met, and to continue to think about our personal and professional roles, right? And this anti-racist work. We'll be your facilitator and your timekeeper and continue to be an active participant. Here's our flow. We want you to look at the community agreements, read them over, choose one that speaks to you today. And then we're going to ask you just to lift up the one that you're going to, we all are going to abide by the community agreements, but which one is really speaking to you today? So let's give you 30 seconds to sort of choose which one is resonating with you as we go into this work today. Oh, excuse me. And when you're ready, feel free to just lift up which community agreement is resonating with you and on one that you're going to focus today.
So the ones that's striking me today is we honor each other at our individual and collective time.
Love it. Thank you.
For me, it's we are accountable to our group and ourselves.
Thank you.
And for me, it's we remain open to new ideas.
Nice. Thank you. I think today I'm really looking at us to anchor our work in critical pedagogy. We're going to talk a lot about Cass from Isabel Wilkerson's work and also ask you some of the work that you've been reading and what have you. And I just feel like it's necessary to remember and to honor the fact that folks have been writing about this forever, probably since 1889. But that's when we really start to learn more as we read and, and question the work, I think. And so that for me is where I am, just anchoring our work really in folks who have done this for a while. And now that Flip is back, I'm going to give you a moment, but Flip, we're asking everybody to look at the community agreements and then choose one that's really resonating with you today. I'll let Chris go and then we'll come back to you to give you a moment.
Yeah, and I'm with the accountability to our group and ourselves, especially as you were all considering, I don't know if you already interviewed a potential addition to the board, but regardless, there's an election coming up within that conversation, right? So as you also think about shifting membership and kind of roles within that, how you maintain accountability to each other, I think becomes even more important as you welcome in new people, right? And still sustain the efforts that you're already leading.
Beautiful. Flip, might there be one of the 5 community agreements that resonates with you today?
I'd say for today, just thinking about the whole reason why we shifted the time, that we honor each other in our individual and collective time.
Yes, and thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
No, absolutely. It's imperative that we honor each other in this work collectively, right? This notion of community, which is extremely important, especially like in a small area like Tukwila. So we want to be able to have flexibility, and the district leaders and site leaders were very flexible with me when I was dealing with COVID, and so I think we just all have to do that. We make plans and then we shift as needed. So definitely. Thank you guys for participating in that. So just a reminder of who we are and why we do what we do, right? That we have a lot of years of experience with this in several school districts. And we really believe in critical race theory, Chris and I. The 4 tenets of racism everywhere all the time, permanence, right? That the purpose of schools is to silence Blackness, that we must cultivate people of the global majority in terms of their voice and their storytelling and their counter narratives. And the most, well, not the most, but one of the really interesting tenets that I think for our conversation is that interest convergence as systems move to autocorrect. And I said this before, and I just want to underscore 1889, right? But systems move to autocorrect when we try and push. And we have to know that when we're pushing on them. So we have to expect there to be resistance, right? So the resistance from the city of Seattle, when they were like, yeah, let's ban CAS, which sounds like a great idea. But then globally, it's like, no, wait a minute, don't call me an oppressor, right? Or when we say we're going to create a curriculum that is based on, many voices, and we're going to ask teachers, and then the pushback on studies, ethnic studies, and that curriculum, the banning of books, all of these things are systemic notions of racism that move to autocorrect whenever we push against that. What does that mean for you as a board? As you are setting up policies and deciding where we want to begin with this anti-racism work and where we want to target, expect that there will be resistance, because there's never been a time when there hasn't been, and plan for resistance. Let's not all be surprised when there's resistance, right? We understand that that systems will autocorrect because it's in the best interest of those at the top of the caste system to remain in power. I didn't want to jump on my soapbox there. So Chris and I model a real inclusive, diverse, and equitable collaboration across numerous differences and oppressions towards active anti-racism. And I love that we put that in because I think we model what we can dream and design that's different. So what I would love you to do now, first of all, how many of you are familiar with Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, or have read the book or have heard anything about it? I see one hand. Do I see any other hands? It's really hard to see. Good, 2 hands. Thank you.
3 out of the 4.
Okay, great. All right, I couldn't see everybody. Okay, great. That's wonderful. Then this will be a review. What I would love you to do is to write down the ranking, assuming that this pyramid, the smallest at the top is the top ranking, and then the bottom is the bottom ranking. According to the US caste system, I'm not asking how you feel about it, but according to the US caste system, these 4 races, how would you rank them according to the US caste system? Let's write that down for 15 seconds, and then I'm going to ask your answers. Okay, when you're ready, just read off your ranking from top to bottom.
And we'll add the caveat. We know that this is not your personal ranking.
So I would do white, Asian, Latin, Black.
I couldn't even hear that. I apologize. What was it?
Sorry, white, Asian, Latin, Black.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, and I the white and Asian is easy. The Latin and Black, I work with so many. I don't know which one is above there.
Okay, fair enough.
I did the same way that Dave did.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Herndon? Okay. Yeah. So a couple of things with the caste system that is amazing. Number one, according to the United States caste system, David is correct, white, Asian, Latinx, and Black. And there's a lot that we talk about with that. And notice who's not even mentioned in the US caste system, right? When we talk about races, right, this notion of race, This gets back to where it's so great that we had this example for Seattle. The notion for many of indigenous folks, depending upon where you are in the nation, is either not mentioned or is lumped in the Asian category, right? And so when Dr. Wilkerson talks about this notion of caste, she's really purposefully talking about the way in which the United States sees different races and does not make room for all of the other, right, nationalities and ways in which we see people differently, because this is what America sees, right? So let's dig into that a little deeper. So the notion of caste is that it endures, it remains based on this notion of divine will or the presumed laws of nature. And so we'll get into that in a moment. And it's reinforced through our culture and passed down through generations. So I love, David, that you shared with us this 1889, because I'm going to keep going back to that. So we already knew it was a caste system, and yet our caste system remains, right? And so this notion of divine will, I will define that in a moment, and presumed laws of nature, but reinforced through culture, right? So easily we could have something on the books that says, let's get rid of caste. And then our culture could say, yes, this is horrible. Let's do this. But it's actually reinforced and passed down, right, through generations. And so this is why we study caste. The American caste system ranks by race. So you could use any type of marker, right? So India's caste system doesn't rank by race, but it ranks by class. So you can use any type of ranking, but what the United States chose was to use this like vague notion of how people look and call that race, and then divide humans based on their perceived appearance, right? Caste is actually the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, human kindness, right? It's the granting or withholding of those things to someone based on their perceived rank and standing in the US racial hierarchy, which means it's based on the notion of how we perceive people. And Dr. Wilkerson is actually doing another version of this, but she's written a lot about things that have happened since her book came out in 2020. And she says that it really could have been anything, right? When we were forming this nation, we could have said, you know what, it's really banked on property. Property could have been the way that we rank people, but we chose to rank people based upon their perceived appearance, which I think is it's just, you know, leaves room for a lot of conversation, right? So there, and I don't think I got this when I read it the first time or the second time, the notion of how a group of individuals was like, no, this is how we're going to determine who is at the top of the hierarchy. We all choose hierarchies, but it's how we rank them. And I just wanted to drive that home because I think I missed that one when I read the book twice. The other piece is caste is fixed and rigid, which basically means that this is the system that's been in operation since we began this country. And race is fluid and superficial. And what that means is that what we determine as white has changed over time. And what we determine as Asian has changed, right? These things become fluid, and it's subject to this redefinition that allows us to maintain the dominant caste position in the United States. So that's like, the book is at least 400 pages, but that's like a really quick overview of what caste is. Let's look at the elements of caste really quickly.
So can I just throw in a quick comment? So we're talking about the 1889, and I've been trying to do a little research, you know, what the word caste meant to people in 1889, and the in the state of Washington was written, not surprisingly, by a bunch of white men, of course, entirely. And so what caste meant to them at that point in time, I'm still trying to do a little research to figure out, why they put that thing in the Constitution. So anyway, there's still research to be done on that. But
Well, Dr. Wilkerson gives us a lot of information about, the original caste system was in India and how, as our country was being founded, how we looked at different things to determine the fact that we needed to rank individuals because that's what we do as humans. And then later, how the Germany's Nazi system looked at our system of caste and used that as their system of ranking of people. So I think it's been around forever. I love the notion, though, of what did it mean to people at that time. But the reality is we as humans feel like we need to rank each other, right? And, it's not a caste system, but if you ever work at a high school, there is clearly a ranking of who's popular, who's not popular, right? Based upon artificial, fluid decisions about everything, right? But this is what we do as humans. I just wanted to underscore that it did not have to be this notion of race, that it really could have been anything, but we're going to have a hierarchy and we have chosen to use race as the metric, if you will. Go for it.
Yeah, just one nuance, and I think this to me helps me think about why there's sometimes confusion around the bottom levels, right, of the caste, is in some part because race is fluid and superficial in this context, but the practice of racism is not. So there's a lot of Latinx, especially recent immigrant populations that are also indigenous, so multiracial, indigenous, and either Mexican American, Salvadorian, Latin American within this context, right? So there's also multiple levels occurring of racism essentially within, right? So anytime we look at an individual within that who has more pigmentation, who has more structural barriers that we have put in place for that person, so language, immigration status, previous schooling systems, where they ranked in their hierarchy from the country they were coming from, all of these spaces and places complicate like the lived experience of the caste hierarchy within that, right? And that's I think the fluidity of race, where, right, we frame it like anti-Blackness is very much the intent of the caste system in the US. But there's a whole lot of other folks who are not Black, right, that we do everything we can to put them as low as we can within these conversations, right? So the structures of racism may delineate how we oppress particular classes of people and that sort of thing, but the actual lived experience, a lot of folks are just like, I don't know, it feels like racism to me, right? So I think there should be a healthy confusion of like, wait, these don't make sense. Yeah, they don't make sense.
Yeah, because it's superficial. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Herndon.
I was gonna say, to me, when you look at the kind of the caste system in India, the image you have on there, the 4 different levels. In India, obviously, they have the untouchable level 2, which doesn't even appear in German. It's the total base, like it's meant like you're not even seen. And I think in our historical context, that's where there has been that level. That's why for many Native American indigenous folks, like they weren't seen. And in the original Constitution, for Black folks, not even being listed as fully human, 2/3 of a person. So I think there's that level of you're so far down, we don't even see, like you're not even seen as human, which I think was also the whole purpose during Nazi Germany, is to dehumanize people. So you don't even fall on ranking. You don't even deserve to be on the lowest level.
Thank you for putting that in. Absolutely. So true. So true. So this quote from Dr. Wilkerson, could somebody read that for us, please?
Race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race is the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Wilkerson says here, again, the notion that there could have been class, there could have been a variety of different mechanisms, different metrics that help us determine how we're going to divide humans. But in the United States, race is that. And I love this notion that caste is the bones of this system, but race is the overlying skin that allows us to make determinations about people based upon traits that are physical. And that's what holds each group in place. So the piece is, you can't move up throughout. So she's laying out this argument that once you are in a certain place in caste, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter who you marry. It doesn't matter if you're the president of the United States, right? These things don't matter, that you are in this position based upon the structure of caste, and you can't move through caste, right? That, which is why you'll see Oprah, right, shopping in Texas and people going, why are you here? And following her around. Like, it's not something that that allows people to try and move beyond that. And then within each structure, and we don't talk about this enough, there are many caste systems within each racial delineation, right? And so don't have time to get into that today, but certainly that's what it's, because it's passed down from generation to generation. It's because it's part of our culture. It's inherent in all of our systems. And even Dr. Wilkerson would say, race, in her opinion, is sometimes insufficient to understand how our system ranks each other, because it's got so many pieces within it. And so we want to understand that it is I think the takeaway here is that it's the physical trait that's been given this like arbitrary, fluid, superficial meaning that allows the system to hold it. So when we say systems move to autocorrect, that's because the caste system is like, I got you, and it's not letting you go.
I think one piece of that is to go back to the city ordinance piece, right? We make city ordinances around the skin, right? We make our so as a policy body, most of our policies are in reference to the skin, not into the structures, the bones, the actual infrastructures of how we enact all these systems, right?
Yes.
So, and that's the key of when Dr. Rajazard said, well, how do we link funding to our policy making bodies? How do we actually link the operational side to policies versus separating intentionally? And you all know this and live this. Like we do a whole lot of things to make it so that policymakers are separate from the actual operations. Some of that obviously makes sense, but that also encourages a thinking around, well, let's address the skin rather than the actual underlying infrastructures, right? We've done this intentionally, right?
So I have a curiosity that I haven't figured out yet, but it runs in my brain all the time. We're such a global society, and we are embracing, maybe not very well, but embracing globalism here in the US. How many of these folks that are coming to us have experienced race already, or is this a new racism? Is this a new thing when they get to the States? Because I know if we're talking about people from India, okay, well, they have a caste system that maybe looks different than our racism system. But I guess I just don't understand enough. If some of our folks are experiencing that for the first time when they get here, because that doesn't quite make sense to me. But everything that we're reading is this is a US system and not a global system.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. I mean, this is, yeah, I love the wondering, because this is a lifelong wonder, right? So I think there's multiple levels happening. Now, I would argue, having spent some time in India and collaborating with a number of Indian academics, racism is just as prevalent throughout the caste system in India. It is probably not surprising to most folks. It certainly wasn't to me that when I was walking around and literally just observing society throughout different parts of India, and I will say the region, Pakistan, Bangladesh, within that, darker complected people just so happen to largely be untouchables. Like there was it just so happened, right? And most folks were like, no, that just sort of happened. And I'm like, well, that doesn't just happen, where literally more people with pigmentation everywhere I've been around the world are generally more in poverty, more fill out all the different pieces, right? So I actually think globally, especially because so we're talking about a former British colony, so racism and anti-Blackness in particular is a specific Western European, a specific British, right? Like what I say, gift that shaped most societies, right? I mean, I say that as right, like that was intended as a gift of here, let's help you run these societies well. So I would argue most folks who come from other countries are coming from a country where anti-Blackness is still intact and fostered and structured, especially like they may not have named that as a normalized piece in that country, and certainly not with the US language lens within that conversation. But everywhere I go and see, and certainly all the scholarship that I read, racism and as a specific anti-Black lens is structured across the way that we frame schools, certainly, no matter what country we're coming from. I also hear a number of people saying I'm not as familiar with that, and I'm often thinking, well, then what were you familiar with where you lived, to where you didn't have to see anti-Black racism, right? Even if you didn't label it in that kind of way, right? We normalize conversation about racism in a specific way in the United States that is definitely unfamiliar to a lot of folks who normalize talking about racism in a different way.
But I think the point is that it's all based in whiteness, right? So I think the point is that light is right. And because of colonialism and oppression, right, there is a global response to the closer we are to whiteness, the better we are. That's just a global response. When I was on the Ivory Coast, and I went to Africa thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to my homeland, right? And the first thing out of the airport that I see is an advertisement for bleaching cream. It was the first thing I saw. And it was like, do you want your skin to look lighter and brighter? Use this bleaching cream. And I remember I took like 5 photos of it because I was like, am I on the Ivory Coast? Aren't I in Africa? Right? But the notion of whiteness is pervasive.
Well, we can go back in the study of art, back really, really early when Jesus became white.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
that happened in Europe. So we're already lightening, and Christianity has been one of the most racist.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So it continues globally. And then what we did in America was to add the caste system to it. I'm gonna hit this next one because I want to get you guys talking. Oh, did we skip we skipped the 8? Okay, good. Okay. All right. So what are examples? Let's talk about divine will. Dr. Wilkerson speaks in caste that one of the 2 main reasons why we're able to continue caste is because of divine will and the laws of, and why did I just blank on that? Can you go back to that slide, Chris?
Sorry.
Where we talk about caste, the other one. There we go. Presumed laws of nature. Thank you. I think in my mind, I was going to say the laws of attraction. So divine will is this notion. Well, what's divine will? Or what do you think it is?
It's the will of God, whatever.
Yes, okay, yes. So this notion that this is God's will, it's God's will for me to be reign over a certain group of people. It's God's will for me to be better. It's God's will for me to be at the top of the caste system. It's God's will for me to have more, be more. It's God's will for me to own slaves. It's God's will for me to, right? This is somehow this divine will that has kept the caste system going. And then the laws of nature is, well, certainly it's, the persons who are most intelligent, the persons who are most readily able to make sense of the world should be the rulers of the world. We should rule the banks. We should be the ones who run governments. We should do that because we're smarter, better. You're made for work. You're made for, right? And so this notion of it is predetermined that a certain group that looks a certain way should be able to be in charge of everything and everyone. It's the way it's supposed to be. And so when we look at the notion of divine will with caste, we want to feel some examples of divine will of whiteness in this country. What examples can you think of the ways in which those who are at the top of the caste system use this notion of divine will to continue whiteness in this country? What examples can we think of?
The anti-abortion voices that we hear are mostly white men.
Why is that?
Because I think they have the power over the female body.
Yes, it's their divine will to make sure that they populate the country. And why specifically white males?
Well, it's just to me, it's just another example of control of pretty much every facet. I mean, it's literally trying to control the bodies of other people on top of banking, on top of laws, on top of law enforcement, on top of courts. Like, it's just an extension of control over having that literal control over other people's bodies.
For sure. And a concern that the Census Bureau has determined, right, that people of the global majority will be the global majority in the United States by 2032, right? And so if we continue to allow births to be terminated, what used to be, or what used to be the majority will now become the minority, and that's a power structure that is going to affect caste, and we can't let that happen. So we're going to take control over people's bodies. That's the whole, right? That's the entire piece around this notion of replacement theory, which is too deep to go into today, but definitely, since you brought that up as an example, that is an example of divine will. It is our will, it is our right, God-given, to manage this so that we can maintain our positionality in the caste structure. Other examples?
So I was thinking about the whole history of voting and access to voting, going back to, who can vote at all, and then going to, literacy tests, or, and even to this day, for, reducing the convenience of voting, or, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And voting, is one of the core sources of power in the country. Also, gerrymandering is another one. I mean, there's just multiple examples of, messing with the voting system.
I think it was
To what end, though? Why would folks in the dominant caste want to control voting? I mean, I
Because-
understand that it brings people into, but what else, like what's underneath that?
Maintain power.
Yeah, it's I mean, people who get in all the elected positions have a lot of power over the infrastructure, as you call it. And so that's a key way you keep control of that.
Absolutely. So we want to control voting. We want to make sure that we maintain power, but we also don't feel like those in the lower caste systems have the intelligence to make a great choice. Right? So first it was women, right? And we're like, oh, well, okay, but they're not really, should they, right? Are they smart enough, right? Even within the caste structure, right? That's what I was talking about, the mini caste within. And then this notion of, well, we need to make sure we, right? Those of us in the dominant caste can make these decisions for the people in the lower caste because they're just not able intellectually or what have you. And even when they make decisions, we're not sure that they're those decisions, we feel that they are flawed. The other piece, though, that's really interesting is when there have been when folks have fought against, right, this notion of divine will around voting, then systems move to self-correct. So what we saw in our latest, in our latest chronicles of the US history, right, is, oh, this is what happens when people at the lower caste can work together and can affect voting. So now what we're going to do, remember, systems move to autocorrect. Now we're going to double down on making sure that those things cannot happen anymore, right? So I feel like there are numerous current examples of the ways in which those in the dominant caste move to ensure power, but also because they just feel like it's God's will that they are better, more intelligent than those in the subordinate castes.
And so we should teach about these things.
We actually do teach about it, and still, I think I have time for one more example.
So I'd say historically, it would have been, I think about manifest destiny. So it's the will of God for people to own land, take possession of land, which goes back beyond just the United States. I mean, that's the whole system of colonization is claiming land and resources, all of that, sometimes by financial means, sometimes by religious means under the guise of religion. In this case, same thing. And then within that becomes, again, another historical position of power because land equals not only influence and wealth. So by doing that, and you see, especially in the Western United States, lots of cities and places that have started because of that granting of land. And when you go back to the original kind of homesteading, it was who was even able to do that. I mean, you had the land rushes where people literally lined up and then just went out and put stakes down. This is mine now. But you have, you still had to be of a certain color and position in order to even be on the line to go grab land, let alone the requirements of holding on and keeping that land. So I would say that was definitely a divine will. And all that was because it was meant to go out and spread and claim the rest of the land of the continent.
We could take land away from anyone who had darker skin.
Well, that was, you even acknowledged that they were on the land.
That's
It's like,
true. That's
this
true.
isn't your land, this is God's land, and he said, I can take it.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the Reverend's point, right? This Christianity, right? Determined who gets to own land, who counts as a body, who counts as a human to right. Are those stakes? I don't know. They were put down by the wrong person. Those stakes don't count. These stakes count, right? That's all woven in.
Well, what does God look like? A white male. Yeah, not really.
Yeah, right, not from that era, in that context.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Dr. Herndon. The Manifest Destiny is just one super great example. Is there anything current within the last 3 years that might remind you of this notion of divine will of whiteness in this country? Anything that happened over the last 3 years? Anything? Anything?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at the, especially in the US, you can just look at some of the changes on the Supreme Court, who was assigned there, who was picked there, how they were picked, all of that. That was a lot of pretty significant manipulation. And in many of those hearings, there's a lot of invoking of divinity in their positions. So that's one I can think of.
Love it. Anything else in the last 3 years? So I will definitely say January 6th was one of the ways in which it is our will to take back our democracy, our rules, our only really was part of one group, and that was the dominant caste. Using fear as a methodology, don't let them take our country. Let's go do something that has really never ever happened before, right? And so, I mean, has happened in terms of oppression, certainly, but just in our country and the ways in which those who were members of the dominant caste, but were also given their jobs were to protect, right? Certain sacred halls, if you will, and even the use of sacred, right, invokes that notion of divine will. And because they were members of the dominant caste, they were given free reign. Because as every single person of color said that day, had there been a group of folks of color from the subordinate caste systems doing the exact same thing, that day would have turned out very, very differently.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've done that, right? So I would love you to get into some dyads. Is that possible? Where you guys are? I feel like there's something. Yeah, okay, great. So I just want you. What did Dr. Herndon say?
Two dyads. We have 4 people here.
Yeah, okay, great. I would love you to just take time to have a little vulnerability and share what's your lived experience within the US caste system. And in order to make sure that you can be heard, maybe if you could move away from, what is it called? Is it the mouse? What is it? The owl. I'm mad I called it a mouse. But maybe you get up, maybe you could walk over to a room or maybe away from the owl to just really take a moment of vulnerability and share your lived experience within the US caste system. And I think we can get 10 minutes for this. And I think Chris and I will go on mute so we don't hear anything. We want to really be able to create a space of bravery that we sort of share our lived experience. And maybe somebody that you're not sitting next to. I don't know. You're
I
great.
don't think in our open meeting policy, we can't go away from the mics.
Yeah, we kind of,
We can't go away from what?
Microphones.
yeah, because it's a
Oh.
public. Yeah.
Huh.
System self-credit. Look at this.
Right.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, in that case, I guess we could do this whole group. I think this, for me, this requires a little bit of safety. And so let's see what happens in our bravery moment. If you don't mind sharing, you know what? If you don't feel comfortable sharing, you can pass. How about that? That will add a little bit of, but if you wanted to share a little bit about your lived experience within the US caste system, I'll leave the floor open for that.
Well, I can do an easy one that doesn't feel very vulnerable, but maybe it is. As I was growing up, my mom taught school in a different school district. And it was the place where more of the indigenous and what we would, if we talked about the caste system, it was a more impoverished area and more Black and brown bodies. And she, my lived experience was that my mom didn't let me go hang out with her at that school. So I was kept safe in her thinking from that. But I was very aware that there was something different. And it made me curious and it made me want to go even more. And I can feel that experience in my body, knowing that there were children that I didn't get to play with or didn't get to know. And I've lived with that feeling my whole life.
Thank you. I thought that was incredibly vulnerable. So thank you for sharing that and for admitting that and for also sharing how it impacts you now. Right? I really appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else?
So I think yeah, one of the ways caste system reflects itself is there's a lot of, in the kind of caregiving world, Black and brown people, new immigrants, so forth. So I think of a situation when my mom was going into hospice and we had folks coming in to take care of it. And they were almost all, relatively new immigrant women, Black and brown people. And so that's just, again, a reflection of, I think, the caste system that we have in this country.
Reflection in terms of there's one of the elements of caste is like what types of jobs we are allowed to have, right? So thank you for.
Yeah, and how the pay, for example, for the
Yes.
kind of like service jobs or caregiving, it just came out, of course, during COVID as well.
Yes. And the notion of who should take care of whom, right? That is always part of the caste system. Thank you so much for sharing that.
My experience was, one of them was traveling with my son's friend, who was a tall African-American young man. And the response people would get us when, like, we would walk into a restaurant, depending on where we were. It was sad. It was just, made me very much aware of what he has been experiencing. And there were many times when he would say, is it going to be okay for me to be there? Which I found difficult to accept.
Right. So this notion of place, right? And that every place is a white space. And so, and that the young man, I made an assumption that the young man was like a teenage or how old, because you said tall, so I just made an assumption.
Yeah.
Right. So that even as a teenager, a hypersensitivity to every space is a white space, I may not be able to be in those spaces. And what does that mean that the dominant culture has allowed the notion of space to be part of what those in the subdominant cultures have to experience. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my first encounters goes back to junior high. But I remember there was a there was a girl who was very desirous, wanted to have a relationship. And so it was, we started talking at school and wanted to progress and go steady or whatever the term was at the time. But then I remember on one weekend, she called me and was, very distraught and upset. And she had said that she couldn't go out with me because her father had seen my sister at a car dealership. And so he was like, no, you can't date him. And she was distressed. She still wanted to see me and was willing to sneak behind her father's back. And I just said, yeah, that's not going to work. So how long is that going to happen? It was very interesting. So we kind of pseudo kept in touch, and, she was a very nice woman and everything. And I think in high school, her mother ended up dying of cancer. And then it was funny because in college, then she dated all Black men. And that was kind of, one of those things. But I talked to her several years ago at a reunion, and she had said eventually her father came around. Also, kind of as he neared the end of his life, he also succumbed to cancer. But that, it was a challenging time for her too, because there's a lot of interfamily dynamics. But that was always one of the things. And, when you think about dating and who to be with and what the family reaction is going to be when you encounter a new person and you're just not quite sure how their family is going to respond to you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. One of the other tenets of caste, right, is the control of marriage and the control of mating, right? And this notion of wanting to keep the purity, right? This notion of purity versus pollution, wanting to keep the line clear so that we can continue to populate the dominant caste, right? And how that shows up in relationships. Dr. Herndon, I was going to share something totally different, but when you said that, and I don't know when that was because, I know that, I'm a little bit older than everybody, but what it reminded me was my daughter in elementary school. So she's 23. So this was not a long time ago. There was a member of the dominant caste who really thought she was cute. And he was like, you are about to be with me. And he told his mother, and his mother came to the school. This is maybe fourth grade, y'all. Like, so what is that, 10? Mother came to the school and he was like, this is Dorielle and this is my boo. And the next day he was like, I can't hook up with you. And she was like, what? And he was like, yeah, my mom said no. And so what was so interesting for me is, as a Black woman, having to hold my daughter in that moment, and also have a conversation that I shouldn't have to have with a 10-year-old from a little boy who is probably not going to remember her in the next, whenever. But it remains, right, I think is the point about caste, right? And this control of marriage and mating in an effort to keep things pure. So thank you so much, Dr. Herndon. That also resonated with me quite a bit. Chris?
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I think an example I was shared, I grew up in an intense family violence context, as well as poverty. And always saw myself as, and really internalized, like, well, people treat me poorly because I'm poor. People treat me poorly because I don't deserve. So I had internalized, so I'm thinking about middle school in particular, 7th grade. I was just like this huge negative self-effect. And I think that's part of the lived experience of growing up in poverty and with violence on top of that, within that context. And my best friend at the time, David, African-American kid who came over to my house. I didn't ever want anybody to come to my house because our house was so just disgusting and condemnable within that. But eventually I couldn't not let him come over. It was like just the excuses I kept making. I couldn't. I hung out at his house all the time kind of thing. So he came over. My father came home when he was home. And N-word comes out all over the place. My dad punches a hole in the wall next to David's head. So super violent. David and I run out of the house, freak out, of course. And I recognized at the time I didn't have the language to think about it, but I was like, as much violence as my dad heaped upon me, that was a different kind of violence. And it was a racialized anti-Black violence. Again, I wouldn't use that language, but I knew that it was like, there is something different about the rage that he just shared, that he shares with me. And like when he hits me versus when he almost hit this other kid who he doesn't even know within that context, right? So I want to say it put within a context of the caste system was super clear to me. I was low as hell. He was lower. But he was middle class. So I was like, this doesn't make any sense in my 7th grade head, because I should be treated negatively because I'm poor and all this kind of stuff, right? This is how internalization works. But why would David be, because his family's middle class. He got both parents in the house, right? Like all this kind of stuff. So there was a disjoint in my head about this caste thing can't happen, right? I'm learning in school that this isn't even real. So that can't happen, but there was something so real about that rage that I was like, anti-Blackness is clearly, again, I wouldn't have used those terminologies, but the seeds were clearly planted in me of like, this caste is a racialized caste system. No matter how impoverished I am and or feel, there is something different that is putting me up in this some sort of pedestal over somebody, and kind of independent of class.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That was super vulnerable. And for more information about the things that Chris has gone through, feel free to see the books that he has written about his experiences. But I like us to pause here, and you're like, well, why did we have to do that? Our lived experience, again, within caste is, as Dr. Wilkerson says, sometimes race is, so normalized that we talk about it, but when we use race as the skin over caste, it allows us to see the systems a little clearer. And so I wanted us all to share those experiences because it's necessary, right? As we move into after break, as we move into policies, let's remember those things. Like, let's remember our experiences that we've all had so that we can shift and make something different for the generations coming after us, right? So thank you for participating in that. And thank you guys. I'm used to this notion of safety. So I was like, oh my God, you're going to be on mics. But yeah, that was good. And
We recorded meeting. It's all good.
and I appreciate your willingness, right, to share part of your experiences. So it's 9:22. Let's take it's 9:23. Right, let's go till 10 till 9. Did I say 10? How long are we going, Chris?
10-minute break.
Okay, so that's awful. All right, so let's go till 9:33. Is that what that sounds like? Okay,
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, guys.
Wow, I had one a couple of years ago that was 12 times the size of that, I think, right?
Yeah.
Just a couple of months ago. Yeah. Speaking of environmental funkiness. Welcome back, beautiful people. We are in our final hour. So as the fun part gets to shift to really make it a little bit more tangible about your roles as individuals on boards and then as a collective board. So you all have seen this vision before. We recognize, especially as this is being recorded, that this is not actually Tukwila School District's vision. This is a framing of a potential a vision that essentially enacts some of what we're talking about. So where we understand, we commit, we act, and then we are moving from essentially, if we can use this Seattle Council's model, from not just doing proclamations, but thinking about building kind of a cross vision to implementation in a context. So I'm gonna, sorry, we gave you homework a while ago. We could probably put CAST on here since clearly most of you have also read CAST, but we wanted to just tap in to see if you have been reading some of these, and then if so, takeaways from those. So these were the 3 books that we have lifted also for the professional development kind of series that we're doing with leadership team. So as you know, we've talked about some of each of these throughout this past year. So number 1 is, have you been reading or have you read some of these already?
Yes.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you for vocalizing that. I'm like, I can't see that. Right. So are you reading any of them now or recently? And then share us a takeaway, something from that you're learning or learned, or that at least helps you think about some of your own work on the board.
So, yeah, I've read Street Data and Black Educational Leadership. So actually, Street Data is a book that I read. I've read kind of at least skimmed sections of it multiple times. Because, you know, so for me, the big takeaway from that one is they talk about, you know, the satellite data and map level data and street data, and the fact that, you know, for years we've been in education looking at just satellite data, the test scores and so forth, and that doesn't provide the answer to the questions of why are things the way they are. And so, you know, this book is mostly about how do you get down into the detail to answer the why questions, and how do you collect, you know, a lot of the qualitative data, and they provide a whole set of different strategies that have been really interesting to me, and hopefully we're doing some of them to get under the surface and try to look at, you know, what's going on, and then what we can do to, as you say, disrupt the system and produce much better outcomes. So it's interesting that one of the things I got out of it was it's pretty popular these days to take shots at the, you know, standardized tests or the high stakes testing, whatever you want to call it. And for me, it's always been, and I think they point out in the book here, is that the question is how you use it. And in the past, it has been used, you know, when we go back to No Child Left Behind is where I kind of track some of this back to. It was used to kind of just punish schools instead of getting to the underlying causes of what's going on. And so, and even in this book, I mean, they criticize them, but at the same time, they cite several examples where, you know, they're used to the high level, the satellite data is used to kind of say, well, here's an area we need to focus in. And then you go down into, you know, the listening sessions, the fish bowls, I mean, there's a whole collection of good strategies that they have for, you know, delving into the why of it. And so, and I think and I completely agree with that. And we need to be, the other one that's been of interest, the aspects of that, because I've been just at a conference of the WERA, which is the Washington Educational Research Association, and there's there's actually a lot of districts that are working on figuring out how to collect this kind of qualitative data that we need to figure out the why. And one of the interesting things is, how do you can collect all that data, and then how do you process it? It turns out that for instance, I was at a session for Seattle Public Schools, and Seattle Public Schools have been focused on achievement of Black males is one of their top priorities. And so part of how they're getting down into, interviewing the community and doing all that kind of stuff. And, obviously that stuff requires, it's fairly first people intensive, and it requires time. And so, one of the things to look and I mean, going down and doing that is good stuff because you're establishing relationships, which is what you want to do. But at the same time, it can be time consuming to try and analyze all this kind of textual data. And so interesting, one of the things I've been interested in is some of the artificial intelligence systems that allow to do text analysis so that we can actually get in and find the main points in a fairly efficient way. And so I've been talking with, a lot of people are working on that issue to make it more efficient. But anyway, there's just a bunch of stuff. Straight Data has been, I continue to go back to it. It's a pretty rich book. And so you can, like most books that are good, you need to kind of go back and review them over and over again. So anyway, that's my take on Street Data.
Super appreciate, as you could imagine, right, the focus both on kind of the how do we actually use what we currently collect and what our systems, right, and then troubling that into how difficult it is to actually change our measurement, even if we want to, because everything that we have is designed to do a specific kind of measurement. Right. So all of a sudden now, right, it's like this is inefficient. It's right. It takes a lot more time. It takes a lot more energy. None of our like teaching instructional frameworks are tied to, so right. So if all of a sudden we're starting to do African American male achievement conversations and deep dive into street data, we don't have a place to input the findings of those stories, those experiences into then improving teaching. Right. So all of these things are still separate, right, by design within this conversation. So I appreciate naming that if we're going to start doing quote unquote street data, that means we also need to change the entire way that we have conversations about quote unquote data and our purpose, right, and integrating those versus what we traditionally do, because they're not aligned in that way, right? That's
that's one of the things that I had down here also is, if we want to actually use what we find, in this state, we have TPEP, which is teacher principal evaluation. And so how do we integrate that into the evaluation system and, infiltrate the infrastructure, if you will, and get things going in the right direction. So
love that word, infiltrate. Thank you for that. Others?
I've been trying to read a little bit of each book, and I'm finding I have to go back and reread and to really be able to digest all the information that's there.
Yeah.
I've also been reading the cultural
Responsive school leadership.
Yes, and that's been intriguing for me, and I will read a little bit of that, go and read a little bit of that. I think our intentions are very healthy, and I think we can get there. But no specific thing to share.
Yeah, no, well, part of what I actually hear you is also some of how I read. We can be inundated. Every book that we have is a different way of modeling how we can move. So at some point, taking pieces from each of these can also help us. And yet, at some point, I will say what I often have a problem with. If you could see, I literally have 27 books all around me that I'm kind of currently reading. Right, there's a benefit to that, and there's also a negative to that, which is then it allows me to not actually deep dive into anything, right?
Right.
So there's also a cautionary tale on that, right?
when you're motioning to the 27 books, are you talking about the trees that eventually become books? Because behind you, all we see is trees in the fall.
Right. No, I'm actually in an office. With apparently too many books around it, right?
I think I would say I'm pretty much like a couple of you in that if you look at where my bookmarks are, and my bookmarks are usually Pancake Chef receipts, because I sit there and read these books. And of course you can't see them, but my bookmarks are about halfway through each book. And I think what I appreciate is that they're all speaking to different approaches. So your book is helping us, I think, is what I'm reading, is helping us see it from the Black educator position. And you know, what I'm finding there is more empathy, more understanding. And then the Street Data, I read this one a while back, and you know, I just love the fact that it takes us away from just looking at the data that we've always looked at. And I think we're still working. I'm still working on making sure that we have the narratives to go along with the data. And so that we're looking at the particulars in our classrooms, and what's working and what isn't. And that it doesn't have to be a traditional type of data to give us guidance. I mean, I love that, because intuitively that's how I work, and it reinforces that that's okay, and that if we don't only rely on the test scores, we'll be able to move the test scores even more. Anyway, and then the 4 pivots to me is more of a personal exploration. I love it in that I love the first part about the mirror. I think that's critical, but I think what I get mostly out of it is that the idea that it's an imperfect journey, and that you know, if we look back at how we've moved in the last 5 years, just since my time of being on the board, just starting the exploration of how race was making a difference in our schools and where we are now, it's an incredible journey, I think, and it's imperfect. And I'm not sure that I think, I guess, I'm not sure that we as a district embrace the imperfection. And I obviously have been the test case in some of that. But how do we permit ourselves to learn together in an environment where we can speak our truth, even if our truth would change tomorrow and we would speak something different? Because I'm guessing all of these authors, including, you know, the cast author, would write something different 5 years from now. And we will write our own personal stories different 5 years from now. And how do we give ourselves permission to be where we are, and yet moving forward, or learning and growing? So that's, yeah.
I love that you are talking about modeling being a human in educational spaces that we presume that we want to help cultivate younger humans, right? Right? And how to actually be who we are in these places while giving grace that who we are changes. How we think changes, right? Of course. And to do that from from like a how do we hold policy conversation while also infusing humanness into that is a beautiful opportunity to model, right? Love that.
It's easier not to do it.
Sorry?
It's easier not to do this work.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so doing this work is really hard. And yeah.
Right.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We wanted to just you know, as a measure of accountability, but also just to hear from you. What, you know, like, where are you? What's opening up for you? What thoughts are happening? I think this is, and if we add, we might as well just go ahead and add, you know, cast, but they are all very, very, very different, but it requires for us, for me, I'll speak personally, it requires an understanding that change has to happen. I think that's the through line for all three books, that, and also for Cass, right? So for Four Pivots, like, I love that he says reimagining, right? So that would be part of our 5Ds, where we're dreaming and designing, right? For Black educational leadership, definitely, we're giving you a glimpse into what Black educators go through, particularly principals. But then we offer in the last chapter, you know, part of this notion of a framework that would help us change. And then for street data, it's like that we got to do something different. Here's the way that we do that differently. And I think the other thing that all three books really talk about is this notion of community, which is the antithesis of white supremacy culture. What we're saying is we got to get in community with folks, y'all. Like, so when Chris says how to be a human, what we're also saying is it requires community. It requires community to do street data. It requires community to be the type of leader you need to be as a site leader. And that's why we have a unique lens on what it takes to lead sites as a result of this research. And it takes really community to understand your four pivots, to understand how you become, like, how you look at the world through the mirror, and the work that you're doing on yourself. So we really wanted to hear from you and give you a chance to share some of the things that you're doing as we move to this next piece. And Dr. Herndon, we know that you are reading all of them. So I'm gonna just, because of time, I'm gonna just move a little bit past that. Not to overlook you, but I know that having spoken to you frequently, I know that you are all in it. So we just want to give you a pass on that. So, you know, I went to see Bettina Love last week, and she always makes me think, and I went back and did some additional reading. And Goldie Muhammad has a new book out called Cultivating Joy. And I just have started to think about this. So this is my little thing, right? This is my little quote that I'm using wherever I go, right? That we must decide, and it's a decision, right? Reverend said, it's much easier not to do this way. I was like, double down on that, right? So we have to decide if we're going to follow the status quo, if we're going to create something new, period, dot. Like, there's no other way around that. And the question is, are we going to hurt the system or hurt the student? And that's our question right now. Dr. Love was like, it's time for a revolution. And it was really funny because I was like, yes, yes. And then I saw some people visibly shrink back into their seats. Like, oh, is that what we're talking about right now? You know, and so, but it was so clear to me that we cannot continue, right? It's got to be one of these four pivots, right? It's got to be something else. Either we hurt this system that we know is doing harm to our students, or we continue to harm our students and hurt them. And that's it, period, dot. So as a result of that, next slide. Last session, excuse me, we discussed the roles, if you recall, and we asked you to complete the Jamboard. And here's what you said. Next session, next slide.
Sorry, it's slowing
No,
down.
no problem. It's technology. So as a result, you can go back and look at the Jamboard. We're happy to send that to you when we send you slide 3. But we looked at, the first question was, what are you going to do as an individual person? And basically what you came up with is this notion of being a learner, being a builder, and being a risk taker. And then we asked you as board leaders, like, what do you think your role is, right, to help to move this district towards anti-racism? And it came up in 4 very serious categories, distinct categories. Apologies for my voice. As board leaders, many of you said the number one thing was to listen, right, with students, community, employees. The second thing you said was to ensure that there's alignment, accountability, and leadership, right? As a board member, your role is to listen and then to ensure that these things happen. your role is also to create, right? To create policy, but also to create spaces for differing voices. One of the things we haven't talked about in all of this is student voice. How do we include that in all the things that we're looking at? That's that street data piece, right? And so being able to create. And then many of you talked about decentering self and decentering whiteness. So when we looked at, we're going to focus on these results: listening, ensuring, creating, and decentering. This is the work we're going to do today and in May. And so which of those would be your area of focus? Listening, ensuring, creating, or decentering? What I often find is when we do work, people go, how do we narrow? How do we narrow to one thing? Like, how do we get to it? This is how, right? We asked you in January, like, what do you think? You put all this stuff on the Jamboard. Now we have taken that, because, Chris is a researcher and he's like, let's look for themes. And I was like, well, that's brilliant. And so we looked at these 4 themes: listening, ensuring, creating, and decentering. And what we want to know right now is, where do you feel like you can sort of hone in, right? And then as a second question, right? And we were going to do breakouts, but we understand that you need to be closer. We're going to do whole group. How are you going to curate spaces for all of these differing groups in your chosen area? So let me make an example for you. If I choose creating, it's up to me to create space. Then the question is, how will I create or curate space for students to hear them, community members, or what they need, and respond to them, and educators, which includes teachers, staff, faculty, right? And central office, site, right? In that area of creating. And so we're going to ask you, we're not going to ask you today, what's your one thing, because that's coming in May. But we are going to ask you, like, of these 4, where do you feel like you really want to hone in? Knowing you can't do everything. All right. And then to start thinking about that. So what I would love for you, I really, really want you to do a turn and talk, because I'm a teacher and that's how I process. So this is killing me that you can't do a turn and talk. But why don't you take a moment to sort of journal some things? Let's do that. Where can you put the previous slide up for them, Chris? So listening, ensuring, creating, and decentering is what we sort of thought that you came up. We want you to choose one of those, right? Next slide. And then as you choose that, think about how you're going to create space or spaces within that chosen area. What questions have I raised for you about what we're asking?
Are you asking each of us to take a different one, or if all 4 or 3 of us take the same thing? That's okay.
Yes, because that tells us, that's a data point. See what I did there? If all 3 of you are like, oh, we're all going to do listening, then that lets us further know that there are some things that we need to go back and think about, right? But it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that you understand that you can't do everything. However, what I also want to say is, it's not up to you to have to all choose the same one.
Okay.
Let's take 2 or 3 minutes to sort of think about what that looks like from your own perspective as a board member, where you feel like you want to hone in, and then we'll have you kind of share out. We may not need 3 minutes, so maybe like 2. Yeah. Let's take one more quick minute. Okay, hopefully that gave you a little bit of time to be like, this is a lot. And we know we're asking a lot in this moment. And I don't think that we're saying you can only do one thing and you can never do anything else. But I do think that when we work with groups, it's very difficult because people want to do it all. Like, okay, I want to dismantle racism tomorrow. I want to rebuild on like the next day. By Monday, we should have this thing licked, right? And that's just not how this works. So we're asking purposefully for you to sort of hone in on something that is near and dear to you. And then we're going to start asking you as homework to be like, okay, what are your next steps? So who would like to go first?
So the one I was looking at is when you say spaces for voice that's create, I guess, spaces for voices. So that's the one that I'm particularly interested in. And you're looking for concrete ideas, actions that we can take? Is that what you're looking for?
No, we're going to get to that. Your area of focus is creating. I just want to make sure I'm checking for understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. And can you just share a little bit about why that spoke to you?
Well, I guess, when I look at, listening and accountability, I mean, you can't listen unless you've created the space for people to talk, for people to voice their issues. So to me, that's the core of it. And then you can listen, and then you can have accountability around what you do with what you hear. But to me, that's the core of it.
I love it. Okay. Sounds great. This is going to be great for our homework.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, David. Who's next?
And I was focusing on ensuring that we align things, hold people accountable, and the leadership we've got policies. Are we aligning them with what we're doing and making sure our leadership is accountable and our staff is accountable?
Yes.
Yeah, and I went with the same one, ensuring it felt like that. Yeah.
Okay. So 2 on ensuring and 1 on creating. So I can't move you. All right. So what we would then hope is that we would have let's have some conversation. What does it look like? What does it look like to ensure alignment? And what does it look like for you, David, to think about creating? And I'm wanting you to just brainstorm, right, at this point, because we often are like, okay, here's the solution, but this is multifaceted, right? And it's much, much, much deeper than just being able to do an activity. Also, let's notice what we didn't choose. right? And so that means that we might want to think about, this was from what you guys put on the Jamboard. So we might want to think about other areas later for listening and how we do decentering later. Not that it's not important, but we're trying to narrow. And what we're narrowing around is creating space and ensuring alignment. That's what I'm hearing.
But aren't we decentering and listening as we're doing that? Because we have to decenter our whiteness in order to create those spaces and ensure things are following our policy. And we need to.
I mean,
listen to-
I'm not saying no. I think what I'm trying to say is we often think we're going to do it all. And I'm asking, how might we narrow a little bit? Of course, but having this training is an effort to decenter whiteness, right? So, and listening to each other. But it's really going to be good for you as board members to be like, here's where we're really going to hone in. We're going to hone in on ensuring alignment and creating spaces. Like that's very concrete, as opposed to we're going to try and do absolutely everything. Is this feeling, how's this feeling for y'all? Chris, lean in. I might not be explaining it well.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I think about is so Dave, to go to Seattle Public Schools is African American achievement and male achievement kind of so I think there's a beautiful effort there to create space for conversation across the district around Black male achievement. Right. I would argue that's an effort to create. I would also argue that does not decenter the infrastructures of the district at all. If anything, that office literally sits outside of instruction. It sits outside of, structurally sits outside of the wing in HR that does the professional development and infrastructure for new teachers and principals and site leads, right? So I would argue that like a narrowly focused work on creating, that's an affirmation, that's a good thing. But it was not designed to decenter whiteness. Right. And in many ways, it recenters whiteness because it doesn't even touch upon, right? Structurally, doesn't have the capacity to touch upon the day-to-day of the district, right? So I would argue that is a positive example of creating. It's not a negative example, right? And I think in some ways, because that was narrowly focused. If they had focused on, in the creation of that, decentering as well, we would not be talking about the Office of African American Male Achievement in Seattle Public Schools because it would have never been created in the first place. Because it would have been created and watered down because it was trying to do everything that actually the district is structured to do, not that office, right? I don't know if that helps or makes it worse. Part of the thing is I hear the how we move is super important, obviously, right? And there's a tangibleness of if we don't create spaces and think about what kinds of spaces you are trying to create.
Yeah, that's the thing.
For whom, for what purpose,
Yeah.
and a deeper dive there and stay with the creation versus you could do a deeper dive on any of the other three as well, right? I think that's part of our point is how do we narrow it down?
Yep.
Stay
And
with
I
the parameters of one of these, right? Go ahead.
No, and I love that tangible example about the AAMA, because as cuts are coming in Seattle, that office may or may not be around, right? And so it was created, but it wasn't funded. Right. And they had to seek their own funding. And so this goes back to at the very top when we were talking about the banning of caste discrimination, like we create things, but we don't look at all of the pieces around it. And we're going hard on create only because this is a great example. So David, we are not coming for you. But what I was going to ask us to do at this next moment is to think about, so for ensuring or creating, what's underneath it, right? There are some, and this requires conversation, right? You got to process it. If we're creating, for example, spaces for students, community members, educators towards what? Think about AAMA and what needs to be part of that creation so it can be sustainable and effective in the work that we want to do. And this is where you're not going to solve this in the next 20 minutes, right? That's why we're starting with it now and going to give you some homework. If it's around ensuring alignment with all the things we want to do, Chris's example was brilliant. AAMA was created outside of alignment. So what does it mean for you as policymakers to think about, man, we want to make sure that our next whatever we're going to create is going to be aligned with all of the other things that we're doing across our school district, so we can move together with one thought, like we're all rowing the boat in the same direction. So what we're suggesting, I feel like I need to just go to, can we go to that homework? Is that the next slide? So we're going to ask you as concrete next steps to share the anti-racist shift you're making around these pieces. Okay, so maybe starting with the homework will make it more concrete for you. We're also going to ask you to read those books, and we're also going to ask you to attend or listen to a learning opportunity. So we're going to ask you to do all of that. But the homework is, if you're going to ensure alignment, what's one shift that you need to make to ensure alignment? If you're going to create spaces, what's one shift that you're going to make to create something? And that's where we're trying to get you to, like, this very narrow focus here as board members. And really, I think it requires a little bit of conversation. So why don't we do that now? What's coming up for you? And how can we help to make this a little clearer? Because I realize whenever we ask you to narrow, it's like, but we need to go big, and we're not, let's go small so we can get big later. What's coming up?
So I'm totally confused about where we are.
All right.
Thank you for saying that.
Not sure I understand what you're asking of us. And at the same time, we're 15 minutes away from ending, and we asked to have a specific conversation with you that we haven't had yet.
Oh,
And I'm worried about that.
So I'm
there was a
wondering,
conversation?
if this is the segue that can happen. So I'm thinking in the ensuring piece,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we
leadership.
could use those four to look at.
On the leadership piece, there, I think, two dynamics of that. One is there's an interview that was just happened for a board vacancy. And that's part of, I think, ensuring leadership. And there's elections coming up in November, two of which, well, actually three of which will be open. So as I think about this, especially from the board perspective, how do we ensure maybe more diverse participation in those pieces? Like, what steps could happen to get folks either interested in running because these are elected positions, or might influence the decision of the board as they're thinking about filling this vacancy right now?
Well, I look at all four of those. We've listened, we've heard, we've gotten some direction. And decentering comes is a big part of what we're trying to do. And then the two central ones, what have we created to allow for more diversity? What work have we done is my question. And is it too late to do more work to ensure that we are putting in place what we heard, or that we're trying to put in place?
Thank you. I didn't know we were going to make this pivot. Happy to make the pivot. But I do appreciate that we're still going to, I would love us to continue with this frame, because we took this frame from the work that you did on the Jamboard, right? So thank you so much for continuing with that. What I heard was two questions. The first question is, how can we diversify our applicant pool? I'm checking for my own understanding. And then the second question I heard is, what can we do to make sure that we have representative voices as we interview? Is that the question?
Well, we're faced with making this decision on a candidate right now,
Okay,
which for some of us, honestly did not meet the criteria we were hoping for as far as diversity. And so do we just stick with the status quo? Because it's what we have? Or do we push back and try something else? I think that's kind of the conversation that we were trying to have the other night. And, or was that just last night? Yes, last night. And, thought that we would bring it before you guys to help us have that conversation.
I got it. I see. And should we be recording this?
We have to.
Got
Yeah,
it.
we need to, so we're just kind of talking in generalities
Yep.
about that.
Yeah. So my first question is, when do we need to have someone on whom someone can be voted in? Is that in the fall? Is this time sensitive?
Yeah, we've been without a board member for
Almost a year.
a year, and we've been putting out feelers to get applicants. And so. We're not having that.
And the challenge is that the board is organized by distinct district areas.
Correct,
So in order to represent that, you need to live in that area.
right,
We've had interest from other applicants that are outside the area, so there was also some conversation about maybe modifying to have one at-large position on the board. We can't do that right away. There's mechanisms that would have to happen in that. The last attempt of outreach was we actually created a postcard that we sent to every door in the vacant district area. And that's how we actually got this last person. They said, I literally got it in the mail, scanned the QR code and put in the application. And so we did send out all of those on top of the other efforts that we had put out there, like knowledge about the opening position in newsletters, other organizations, neighborhood organizations, things like that. So, but you have to live within the defined area, which makes it somewhat of a challenge. All that said, that's just for this position. Then we do have two other positions that will be opening up. And the challenge in the past has been, there have been a lot of people to submit to run for the board positions. So I think those are the two kind of areas, but the immediate one is, there is an application, there was an interview. Now the board is at a kind of decision point, and I think they're mulling through the impacts and all of the things that we've been talking about for the last year or so.
And so just to add a little more complexity to it, so this immediate position for District 3, we have committed to do a vote on it on Tuesday. It's also not entirely because this has been vacant for so long, the law requires that our local ESD will fill the position if we don't fill it. It's unknown when they might decide to do that, but anyway, that's out there. And then, so there's this kind of immediate window. And then as far as the fall one, November election, we have a filing kind of deadline coming up in May. So we have a 2-month window here to, potentially, and I was thinking about doing some, reaching out work, recruitment work to try and find some, some candidates who would be interested in filing in the May window for running election in November. So we've got a couple of things, a couple of dynamics going on there.
And the qualifications of the applicant that we have before us are outstanding. There's nothing about the qualifications. It is totally about race, I believe. I could be wrong. That's what I believe.
so given So again, thank you for telling us I feel like we could have done a better job framing this, but a couple of things come up for me. Number one, are you actively saying on like the postcards that went out that we're looking for applicants of color?
No, I don't think we put that in there. I think we just put that we have the position open and available.
So-
I'm trying to also like there are a couple of things about how I'm just thinking about where how the board lists items, and it's not like a typical job posting.
No, I get that. I also get that legally we can language such as we welcome, applicants of color and encourage applicants of color to apply. We seek, and like there's language that we can put on anything that's out there that lets folks know that this is what we're looking for. So that's one thing that when that language is there, it also gives folks in the dominant caste a moment to go, oh, this might not be for me, right? Also, I'm wondering, given the fact that all of the qualifications were great, how many questions, interview questions are asked around what's your anti-racist lens? How comfortable are you with the racial equity? Like, are there questions that would further let the applicant know that this is where we're going during the interview process?
Yeah, that was definitely there.
Okay. So I think it's short-term, long-term. Short-term, we'll see what the vote is on Tuesday. Certainly don't want to in any way influence the vote. I think your local ESD is Puget Sound ESD, correct? And so if they have to, I'm assuming they appoint someone.
Yes, with the same restrictions, like the person still has to live within that area, they still would have to do the same, piece. And we've actually already met with them. I've met with them with our board president director, so.
Okay. So I think without trying to in any way influence voting, I think it's necessary to determine if, even though this person will not diversify your board, if this person is ready, able, willing, and has a background around anti-racism, racial equity, and will be able to hold the work. I think the most important thing is, can this person hold anti-racist work, given all that you know? Can this person be a proponent of it? Does the person demonstrate the courage to stand in the midst of opposition and resistance? All the things we talked about, right? How well you feel this person can be a co-conspirator and not just an ally, all the things that we know. And then you would need to make that decision as you feel best. So that's short term. In the long term, there's going to be two other things. I think it's going to be necessary, and we can definitely talk about this more because I know we're coming towards time. And again, apologies, we would have framed this much better. We know we're going to have this conversation. I think being able to talk about, have a policy around, or I don't even want to say a policy, but that folks, how do folks know that this board is working towards anti-racism, that we're using an anti-racist lens, will help to shift how people see the board. So, using language like here at, Tukwila School Board is focused on, applying anti-racism or anti-racist policies or lenses or whatever to all of the work that we do. And we're sick, right? Being able to put some language in both on your website as well as when you're looking for applicants that says something like, this is what we're doing for anti-racism. We're actively seeking folks of color, blah, 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 blah. I think that will shift the type of applicant you receive. Given what you said, Dr. Herndon, we can't promise that suddenly out the woodwork. There's going to be like this great deluge of folks of color, but I also want to take people who are active in the fight, right? Even if they are not of color, right? So I don't want to lose those opportunities. That's off the top of my head without knowing much more. I'm gonna lob it over to Chris.
We can talk about longer term strategies later. I feel like the immediate, we have a couple minutes left anyway, right?
Right.
The immediate is what is right, filling that spot, knowing how difficult it is to fill that spot in a couple days. So if that person makes sense, then right, you all vote how your heart says, right? I think we can schedule another conversation where we can talk about for the next 2 months specific strategies, Dr. And then we can talk about how to do that. Because I think there's immediate and then there's also longer term strategies. The longer term strategies, we can weave in some of what our conversation around these 4 kind of ways of moving that you've already identified for longer term. Shorter term, meaning the next couple of months, I'm like, let's meet with some community-based organizations and other local advocacy groups to also talk about. Now, I know some of you have already been doing some of this, so I think we can elevate some of that as well in our next conversation.
I'm pretty sure that was not as helpful as you want. Like, I feel like you wanted to be like, do this, but we can't really say that. But what we can say, to your point, Chris, is short term, we're going to ask you guys to vote your conscience. Long term, I think we can definitely talk about some strategies, how we listen, what are we creating for new members, right? And how are we ensuring that it's aligned, and how are we decentering? To me, that looks like how we are putting it out there to new folks and what types of questions we're asking when folks are coming into being interviewed. And how are we cultivating the communities in those areas where we're going to have openings is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, you know, that quote you put up there about harm to the system or the student. See, that's where I'm living right now with this decision. I don't know. I don't know how to weigh the harm. Because I
get
think
it. I get it. And I think in this particular case, we have to vote our conscience, understanding where we're trying to go. And it comes back down to how well do you feel like this candidate will be able to lead this charge as a board member, lead the charge of, and when I say this charge, I mean the charge of anti-racism within Tukwila School District. I want to be specific. I think it comes down to how well do you think this person can lead the charge towards anti-racism in Tukwila School District? And then you have to vote as you feel led. This is a rough ending, y'all. So I'm going to try and tie it up. Okay, so normally we have really great endings. So here's where we know. We're going to meet again in May. We're going to ask you to continue reading. We're going to ask you to do something, either attend some sort of training or listen to a podcast, something that's getting you right. We're very, very big on how are you moving so that you can lead the work. There's one notion of participating in the work and the other one is leading. And we'll send that to you when we send you slide 3, so you don't have to feel like you're losing this. And then as you have decided, so far we're talking about creating and ensuring. What do you think is one step? This is where we get to that concrete action step. What's one concrete action step that you can take that will be creating either something for folks towards anti-racism or that is ensuring alignment, since those are the 2 that we are looking at. And then we're going to come back and talk about how you could do those steps, right? So just to review, read, attend something, listen to something, open your mind, right? Think about a concrete action step, and then we're going to see you again in May. And again, we'll send this to you with slide 3 and the Jamboard results and all those other things so we can make that happen. And you know what? The vote that you take on Tuesday will be what the vote is. It is what it is. There's some structural pieces, and I want you to vote your conscience, and then we will move forward accordingly. Understand that you've done all you can do in this moment.
I think the one additional, you kind of asked to do something. So when you say our next meeting is in May, you know, that's kind of when the window for the new
Right.
new members closes. So I think for us, we need to actually, I think we've started, but put on our agenda, you know, specific outreach that we can do to our community, you know, before then. So that, you know, hopefully we can get by May, somebody, you know, some folks applying for the position for the vote in November. So I kind of just add that to our list.
And I'm
Okay,
wondering
we'll
if we
add
could
that.
do, yeah, we can, I mean, right, so knowing that we collectively come together too late for this conversation, but and I know we have some conversations scheduled one-on-one with you all, but that's also next month. So I'm happy to try to figure out if one of us can jump on a phone call with one of you as well, because I think that could engage with some. You obviously have some pressing energy, because you should. So if it's helpful to talk to one of us before then, Dr. Herndon, I don't know how easy it is to arrange that, but we can try to do something like that too. At least.
But we do have our one-on-one scheduled for April, correct? So it's
Right.
before the May. And so we do have those. Also, we do meet with Dr. Herndon. So let's put this on our agenda. We meet with him on first Fridays. We have scheduled one-on-ones with, they're really one-on-twos with you individually, where we would love to be like, you're like, listen, how do I do this? Right? Like, so we can have those conversations. And if need be, we can schedule another Zoom if we need to with everybody. We just have to figure out what the scheduling looks like.
Good.
All right, board members, you got a lot going on. Thank you so much for moving to 8 a.m. I know their services are happening, and so sending all positives and light to you as you honor a colleague. And you got a lot on you, so take a deep breath. We will work together in community to work with it. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We hear.
Second.
Move in second, that we adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Unanimously, we are adjourned.